There's been like brunch orders.
Actually, the conversation for this test goes back pretty far. It goes back all the way to 1840 and all the way up to 1860. So this is the 20-year period that's really kind of instrumental to the start of the Civil War, which is in 1860. And it starts with the election of William Henry Harrison. Now, if you were to recall anything about the election of William Henry Harrison, what do you recall? Right? What do you recall? William Henry Harrison is elected president. Let's start with this. When? What year? 1840. Right? What political party was Harrison associated with that made it unique? Go ahead, Jason. He was the first Whig to be elected president. What was significant about Harrison's presidency? Oh, you remember this, yes.
Shortest.
It was the shortest. He died in a mere 4 weeks. Not only did he die in a mere 4 weeks, he was the first president to die in office. So naturally, Marissa, who took over for Harrison? Tyler, who was the vice president. Now, Tyler was a Whig also, but we argue that Tyler was a Whig in name only. What did we mean by that? That he was a Whig in name only, yes. Yes, he held many democratic views, and the only reason that Tyler was a part of the Whig Party is because he had opposed Jackson and nullification and Jackson's dictatorial powers. But as a Whig, as a Whig that really didn't support the Whig ideology, Tyler is going to come into conflict with the, I guess if you want to use the term, legitimate Whigs, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who want to pursue this agenda of the American system. Now, we said because of this conflict, Tyler is going to veto a lot of legislation, and Clay and Webster aren't going to like it, and the legitimate Whig Party isn't going to like it. But it causes Tyler to kind of try to focus the country on another issue. And that issue is going to be expansion. So Tyler ascending to the presidency, the conflict between Tyler and the legitimate Whig ideology is going to result in an attempt to refocus political attention onto the issue of expansion. Now, a term that you might want to associate with this, and this is on the test, is manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that the United States was destined to spread its institutions, its values, its culture, its governmental systems from Atlantic to Pacific. You know, that these were superior to others and they were destined to spread. And Tyler is going to be an advocate of manifest destiny and expansion. And we talked about the areas that this affected. We said, look, that this kind of expansionistic sentiment of manifest destiny is going to result in conflicts with our neighbors. Now, I mean, in chapter 17 in your book, there's a little discussion of the conflicts that we didn't talk about. One in particular you might see on the test is something called the Aroostook War. The Aroostook War. Aroostock. Aroostook War. But the ones we did talk about were Oregon and Texas. Now, Ellis, you spent some time in Oregon, did you not?
I was born there.
You were born in what valley?
I want to say Silicon Valley, but that doesn't sound good.
Willmot Valley, right?
Oh.
You know, of Oregon, and people migrated in large numbers to Oregon in the 1840s, and we talked about how that migration to Oregon is going to result in expansionists demanding that the United States annex 100% of what was considered to be the Oregon territory, right? 54-40 or fight. the annexation of all of Oregon is an issue that is aroused by this notion of expansionism. Now, we also said the bigger issue was the annexation of Texas. Now, there aren't really any questions on the test about the Alamo, the Texas, the war for Texas independence. The test picks up with Texas being an independent country, recognized by the United States, and the debate over whether or not to annex Texas. So we said that expansionism and the debate over whether the United States should expand and how the United States should expand spills into the election of 44. Here is a fun question. Who were the candidates for the presidency in 44? Who was the Whig candidate? After Tyler is thrown out of the Whig Party, who do the Whigs nominate in 44? Go ahead, Joel. Go ahead, Katie. Not Pierce. No. Who's the big Whig?
Clay.
Henry Clay. Right? Henry Clay is the big Whig. So Clay is nominated for the last time. Remember, Clay had been a presidential candidate in 28 and 24. Clay had been a presidential candidate in 32. And Clay is now, again, a presidential candidate in 44. And he expects to win the presidency in 44. Noah, who do the Democrats nominate in 44? Go ahead. Polk. And he's the first dark horse candidate for president. You know, the Democrats expect to nominate Van Buren, but it is Calhoun that denies Van Buren the nomination in 44, and Polk, a Tennessee governor and representative, gets the nomination, and Polk is an unabashed expansionist. And so Polk, with the support of many Southern expansionists, is elected to the presidency in 44. Now remember, we said this, that things might have been different if Clay was elected. Why? Now think about what we've talked about so far. You know, we said, look, one of the big things is Polk was elected, Clay wasn't. All right? If Clay was, and we said maybe if Clay was elected, it might not even have been a civil war. How can we make such a case? Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I'm going to say about Mexico.
Okay, so you were going to say that Polk is responsible for the Mexican War? How so?
Because he wanted California really badly.
So in terms of expansion, Polk wants to resolve the Oregon question, which he does. Oh, incidentally, how is the Oregon question resolved? Where is the border? We wanted 54-40 or fight, but we don't do that. What do? We divide it at the 49th parallel. And he really doesn't have to address the issue, Polk, after electing of Texas. Why not, Christian? Why doesn't he have to bother with Texas after he's elected? Go ahead, Christian. Army? Why doesn't he have to bother with Texas? I mean, he wants to annex Texas, but after he's elected, he doesn't bother with it. Why? What did he say? Yes, Texas was already annexed, correct. Right? I mean, it was annexed in the late stages of the Tyler administration. So he didn't have to bother with that, but he wants California. How does he originally want to acquire California? Buy it. But when the Mexicans are unwilling to negotiate for it, he moves troops and threatens a declaration of war. Now, we don't know whether Polk purposely provoked war with Mexico or not. It appeared as if he did, but we do know that the Mexicans attacked us, at least in our version of the story. And when that happened, right, it prompted the Mexican War, which really was a very brief war that resulted in a huge territorial acquisition by the United States and was resolved by a treaty. What was the name of the treaty? Does anybody, go ahead, Schwartz. Pardon me? Guadalupe Hidalgo was the name of the treaty, which resulted in the United States acquiring the Mexican cession for $50 million plus picking up $3.25 million worth of Mexican claims. Now, the Mexican cession that that was acquired is going to create controversy. What's the controversy over this huge acquisition of territory? Go ahead, Ishwari. Did you hear that again?
Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Whether it be slave or free.
Whether it would be slave or free. What provision or proposal in Congress embodies that? Yes.
The Willmot proviso?
The Willmot proviso. What would the Willmot proviso have provided for, Morrison? The Willmot proviso is what embodies this controversy over whether or not slavery should spread into that territory. If the Willmot proviso would have passed both houses of Congress and been signed by the president, what would have been true?
That would have been a slave state.
No, actually,
It would have been a free state.
go ahead, Paige, help your best friend a little bit.
That slavery couldn't exist at the one time.
Yes, that slavery would not be permitted to spread into the territory acquired from Mexico. So the Willmot proviso, now did the Willmot proviso ever pass both houses of Congress? No. Right? Passed the House of Representatives, does not pass the Senate. And so the Willmot proviso lays open the question of slavery in the Mexican cession. Now, we said that in the aftermath of this proposal, the South and the North kind of take sides. The South is going to argue that Congress does not have the authority to prevent slavery, that the Willmot proviso was basically unconstitutional. That Congress doesn't have the authority under the Constitution to prevent slaveholders from bringing their slaves into the territories. Now, the North is going to argue that the Willmot proviso is constitutional and should be passed. That Congress does have the authority to regulate slavery in the territories and should do so. If you think about it, that question that is sparked by the Willmot proviso is resolved to some extent by the Dred Scott case that we just talked about a moment ago in the 8th period, several moments ago in the 7th period, and even more moments ago in the 3rd period, right? The Dred Scott decision addresses that question. Could Congress regulate slavery in the territories? The South had said no from the time the Willmot proviso was proposed. The North had said yes. The Dred Scott decision basically said the Willmot proviso, the Missouri Compromise, the Northwest Ordinance, all of those efforts to prevent the spread of slavery were ultimately unconstitutional. That's why the decision was such a big bombshell. Well, at this time, it is still in dispute. And remember, both sides attempt to sidestep the issue in the election of 48. Who are the presidential candidates in the election of 48? Who is the Whig? Go ahead, Julie. Zachary Taylor. Who is the Democrat? Who is the Democrat? Yes.
Lewis Cass?
Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass you should associate with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is that compromise notion between, prohibiting the spread of slavery and allowing the spread of slavery. Remember when this Willmot proviso, unleashes this controversy over whether or not slavery should spread into the Mexican cession. Some people say, well, wait a minute, rather than argue about it, let's just let the people that go there decide. And the popularity of popular sovereignty is that it seems democratic. Now, it seems like, well, okay, if we let the people decide, then this will be democratic. Now, the problem of popular sovereignty is evident in what happened in Kansas. When do you actually make this decision? Who gets to make the decision? Should the majority be able to take the rights away from the minority? Right? I mean, should you be able to have an election that takes away people's rights, right? I mean, enslaves people. Can you vote to enslave people? You know, I mean, there's a lot of interesting questions around popular sovereignty, but Lewis Cass and Stephen A. Douglas are going to cling to popular sovereignty, and popular sovereignty becomes the notion that unifies the the Democratic Party. Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats are going to remain unified up until the Dred Scott decision under popular sovereignty. Now, we're still in the election of 48 and Zachary Taylor wins. Remember I talked about that election? Remember I said, you know, look, there were 30 states and Taylor won 15 and Cass won 15, but Taylor's states had more electoral votes than Cass's states. And Taylor, who was from Louisiana, wins the election, and he is a Southern slaveholder, and Southerners are confident that Taylor is going to support them. Now, that is not what happened. Remember we said that both sides are going to avoid the issue of the extension of slavery in that election. That's why there was 15-15. They didn't focus on issues, right? Now, but Taylor is going to ultimately disappoint Southerners. Why? What does he do? What becomes controversial? Go, Jason.
He allows California to decide.
Yes. The issue that Taylor faces early in his administration is the entrance of California into the Union on what basis? Why does this sneak up? Why does the issue of the entrance of California kind of sneak up on Taylor and the country? Go ahead, Jordan. The California Gold Rush swells the population of California, demands that there be government there, and Taylor tells the Californians to basically decide the issue of slavery, and whatever they decide he would honor, and they could enter the Union on that basis. Now, California decides to come in as a free state. When they do, the South becomes nervous that they'll lose. I mean, it kind of goes to what we were talking about today. You can see the South worried about losing veto power, right? As long as they had parity in the Senate, slave and free states were equal, they could prevent anything from happening to slavery. As long as they could elect a Democrat that would be beholden to the South for their election, then they wouldn't have to worry about anything threatening slavery. But when they start to lose these things, like California coming into the Union as a slave state, that's when they start to threaten secession. And California's entrance into the Union is something that caused Southerners to threaten secession. And it is into that picture that steps Henry Clay with an attempt to compromise with the South over California. And remember what Clay does is that Clay attempts to deal with everything, not just the admittance of California into the Union as a free state. And there were lots of issues, but the big two were California coming in as a free state and the issue of fugitive and escaped slaves. Now, we talked a little bit about fugitive and escaped slaves, and talked about the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, and we mentioned the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was really something that Southerners had come to really despise. Harriet Tubman, who is mentioned in your textbook, and there is a picture of her there, is kind of the person we associate most prominently with the Underground Railroad. As a conductor, somebody who went into the South, assisted slaves in escaping to the North, and becomes associated with that. But that prompts Southerners to say, well, look, we want a stricter new fugitive slave law. And so the result is that Clay forms this compromise that has 8 parts to it. And he presents this compromise dramatically to the United States Senate, and then implores the senators and the country to accept all 8 parts of the compromise to save the Union. And remember, we went through that, and boy, was that interesting stuff. How about it, Noah? You went home and told your mom and dad gee, I learned a lot in school today, right? I imagine you did that. Boy, I learned a lot about the Compromise of 1850. And, you know, Clay presents this sick and ailing. Webster supports it in his last hours. Calhoun opposes it, you know, and we talked about Seward even. Seward, who we mentioned yesterday, is one of the participants in this debate, and Seward is going, what is Seward's contribution to this dispute? What does Seward's contribution, what does we become known for in this debate over the Compromise of 1850? Does anybody remember? We mentioned it only in passing. There's a question about it in the text. Go ahead, Jim. He was against the compromise because he said there was the higher law of God. He represented, Seward represented the extreme northern position that opposed the compromise. Calhoun represented the extreme southern position that opposed the compromise. Now eventually the compromise is going to pass, not because Clay or Webster or anybody else convinces a majority of senators to support it, but it is going to pass because it's divided by Stephen A. Douglas into 5 parts, and then separate coalitions are formed for all 5. And so it passes, and when it does, the country celebrates. Oh, incidentally, you know, Webster in particular's support of the compromise is going to be very damaging to his reputation. The abolitionists in the North are going to be furious with Webster. Oh, incidentally, another thing about that compromise, which eventually passes. What does Zachary Taylor do to facilitate the passage of the Compromise of 1850? Yes. Yes.
He died.
He dies, right? Yes. And Millard Fillmore, who is a supporter of the compromise, is going to be, you know, going to push or help to push it through. What part of the compromise did Northerners like the least? What part? Go ahead, Charlie. Yes, the strict new fugitive slave law. And we talked about that, you know, in length a little bit yesterday. We said, look, this strict new fugitive slave law antagonized Northerners because they believed that they had to become complicit with slavery. And one of the things that they do to address that is they pass in their own states personal liberty laws. Now, we made reference to these, but not as personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws were state laws that were intended to give fugitive slaves some rights. There was nothing the South resented more than personal liberty laws. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, because we said this was an attempt by the North to circumvent the compromise, and in the Southern view, the Constitution. Now, in the election of 52, who was the Whig candidate? Who was the Whig candidate in the election of 52? This is a hard one. This is a hard one. Does anyone know besides the instructor? Yes, go ahead. Winfield Scott. The significance of Winfield Scott is he was the last Whig to be nominated for the presidency. So Winfield Scott is the last Whig. The Whig Party disintegrates over slavery. Southern and Northern Whigs just cannot agree on the issue of slavery. In the aftermath of the compromise, Northern Whigs had a difficult time supporting the compromise. Southern Whigs were more likely to support it. Northern Whigs were more antagonistic to it. It results in the demise of the party in 52 with Winfield Scott's defeat. Now today, we talked about what politically happens when the Whig Party disintegrates. When the Whig Party disintegrates, those people who cannot join the Democrats, many Southern Whigs are going to join the Democrats, but those people in the South that cannot join the Democrats and people in the North that cannot join the Democrats are going to look for new political homes. The first place that they go is the Know-Nothings. That is centered around nativism and anti-immigration. The second place that they are going to go is the Republicans. That is a backlash against Kansas Nebraska. The reason the Republicans are going to be second is that Kansas Nebraska isn't passed to 54. You know, the Whig Party disintegrates in the aftermath of the election of 52. And so originally the know-nothings look like they're going to be the replacement. But Kansas Nebraska galvanizes northern public opinion behind preventing the extension of slavery in fear of a slave power conspiracy. Now, the Kansas Nebraska Act that is passed by Stephen A. Douglas in 54 is so controversial. Why? What at the core was wrong for Northerners about Kansas, Nebraska? Go ahead, Doug.
It made the Missouri Compromise
Yes, it made the Missouri Compromise null and void. Now, I talked about this in 8th period, but didn't talk about it in 7th and 3rd period. It also represented, right? It also represented kind of a retreat from the traditional ideology about slavery in America. This is why people like Lincoln hated it. They hated Kansas, Nebraska because Lincoln is going to argue that the founders of the country acknowledged the evil of slavery from the beginning. They knew it, they recognized it, they were embarrassed by it, and they wanted to isolate it, prevent it from spreading, and put it on a course of ultimate extinction. And that all of the subsequent legislation, like the Northwest Ordinance, like the Missouri Compromise, even the Missouri Compromise, no one in the Missouri Compromise was defending slavery necessarily as being good. Because Southerners agreed and voted for a compromise that would have prevented slavery from spreading north of the 3630 line. Never before had an area that had been free become slave. We made the point in 8th period that all of the places, all the states that entered the Union as slave states had been places where slavery had already existed. Even Tennessee, Kentucky, which had been parts of Virginia and North Carolina, Louisiana that had slavery under the French, Missouri that had slavery under the French. You know, all of these places were places that already had slaves. So nowhere had the federal government allowed or encouraged slavery to spread. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a departure to that. That's why it was such a controversial piece of legislation, and it unifies public opinion in opposition. Oh, how would slavery be determined in Kansas and Nebraska? Yes, popular sovereignty. And we see that the result of that is that you know, we have the bleeding Kansas, as it's called. You know, because Kansas was slated to be slave. And we talked a little bit about, you know, the elements of what happened in Kansas, 2 separate legislatures. Oh, what was the Immigrant Aid Society? We had mentioned that again today. Go ahead, Joe.
They wanted people from New England to move to Kansas to become people.
Yes, they wanted to finance people going from Kansas or into Kansas to vote for a pro-slavery legislature. Now, in addition to kind of the political actions that were taken, we also suggested that things like the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law and the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin intensified public opinion in the North and in the South. And there are a couple of questions about Uncle Tom's Cabin on the test. One is that it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the intent of the book, what would you argue Stowe's intent was in writing the book? You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin is this enormously popular. Go ahead, Charlie.
Like put everybody like north and south, like west, like kind of all like in this book to see how like slavery actually is, and
Yeah, I think you put it in a nice way. You said, so that everyone could see how slavery actually was. How was it evil? To some extent, Stowe's intent was to expose the evils of slavery. And clearly she has great success in this. The popularity of the book, the sympathy Northerners had for it, the intensity of public opinion as a result of it is evidence of that. And we say that Uncle Tom's Cabin has an international audience. It is translated into 20 different languages. It is translated into 20 different languages, and it is widely read in England and in France. And during the Civil War, when British and French recognition become important, the fact that the populace of England and France had read Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be important. There's another book mentioned on the test that you might look into. It's called The Impending Crisis of the South. The Impending Crisis of the South is something you might want to take a peek at. Now, back to Kansas. In terms of Kansas, I mean, some of the reason I'm jumping around a little bit differently than your notes is because your textbook handles these topics a little differently than I do. You know, I went through, the questions on the test will always come in the sequence that are in your book, right? But sometimes I kind of think that things make more sense if you talk about them in a different way. So there's some slight differences. I mean, they talk about the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and Uncle Tom's Cabin in different chapters in your text. I talked about them together, right? So now back to Kansas, right? I think that if you look at Kansas, you can see the impracticality of popular sovereignty. You know, this compromise measure of popular sovereignty becomes impractical. Now, in the election of '56, who is the Republican? We did this today, just minutes ago. Who is the Republican candidate? Yes. Who is the Democratic candidate? Miss Nancy. Miss Nancy. Right? We don't know why. We don't know how Buchanan carried himself. All we know is Jackson. The man's man, too. Right? So Buchanan is the... and why would you say, based on our conversation just a moment ago, Buchanan ends up victorious in this election? What did we say underlined some of the sentiment? Go ahead, Jason.
The South threatens to secede.
Yes, the threat to secede. You know, one of the interesting things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that are they actually going to do it? Eventually, some Northerners are going to say, hey, they're never going to do it. They threaten secession to get what they want. And when they get what they want, they were never going to secede. After they actually go in 1860, there are people that are going to want to come up with a compromise. The Credendon Amendments, you know, that's on the test, I hope to get to tomorrow, is the last attempt to compromise with the South, right, after they secede. Well, some people aren't going to accept them because they say, well, you know, we're sick of this. We're sick of kind of capitulating to the South as they threaten to secede every time, and they're never really going to do it. Well, they actually did it, and you know, I mean, whether that actually was going to count, I don't know, but they do. Now, when we resume tomorrow, we had already talked about the Dred Scott decision, right? There are a few more things on this test that we'll talk about tomorrow. But for the most part, we have covered everything that I think will be on. But there's probably about 4 more questions. Let's hope, against all hope, that we do not have a delay. Because if we do, we are going to go forward, because we'll cover almost all of them by tomorrow. And you should read chapter 19 in your textbook as well. All right, well, that's it for today. It started a little early. Yes? Swimming. That's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Anything else?
Mr. Wallace.
Time to wait an hour for the activity, Will.
It's over.
I work seven.
Mr. Wallace. Is that the end then?
What's that?
Is that it then?
Man of the year.